Today, August 29th, marks the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. That tragedy killed almost 1,400 people. Gustavo Valdez spoke with workers who helped bring New Orleans back to life in the years since.
"20 years after Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans, you can see signs of the new life in the city. These houses are an example of the recovery in the lower Ninth Ward, one of the city's most affected areas. Angelica Rivera is one of the many workers who helped bring it back to life. Is the New Orleans you see today the same New Orleans you came to?
No, not at all.
With small children, one barely a few months old, she moved from Orlando after the storm, following her husband, a handyman who saw an opportunity working in construction.
I'm not gonna lie, I cried a couple times because I was like, I don't want to be here.
Because basic services like drinking water and electricity were slow to return. But they didn't give up, growing their business from a small team only doing house framing to a full-service construction company, helping many homeowners who they say were swindled by contractors who took their money and left town.
So a lot of people were without money and without a house.
Their growth was fueled by thousands of workers who came from across the country and outside the U.S. to work in construction.
Because most of the people that was here was Latinos.
Who worked in difficult conditions, battling the intense heat and humidity to rebuild this iconic American city. Their efforts are celebrated in this sculpture in the infamous Ninth Ward, ground zero of the deadly floods.
I really believe that they were key in trying to get the New Orleans area back.
Dr. Juan Hershanik commissioned the sculpture after speaking with children of those workers, who he says were shy about their parents' profession. He wanted them to be proud of the work their parents did.
Undoubtedly, that was my first goal.
High praise coming from a person considered one of the heroes of the post-Katrina tragedy, evacuating premature babies out of the hospital, manually blowing oxygen to one of them for hours, accolades he'd rather be given to others.
The understanding of how much the contribution of the Latinos was made during the post-Katrina recovery time.
Many of those came thinking their stay in the Big Easy would be temporary, but now they call it home. According to the U.S. Census, the Hispanic population of metropolitan New Orleans has doubled in the past 20 years. The number of Black and white residents has decreased.
Someone say that if you drink water from the Mississippi River, you stay in New Orleans and you will never leave. I think I did that because this is our home now.
Gustavo Valdez, CNN, New Orleans.